wouldn't overstate the Republican control of the House. When you look at the Republicans, most of them are quite happy to line their pockets with cash, just like the Democrats, as a result of this mammoth wealth transfer that's going on with Ukraine and the Department of Defense and the national defense industries. They're also happy to take donations from the Chamber of Commerce and others who want the cheap labor. In other words, there's still large numbers of people in both parties willing to cooperate to keep the status quo going, because the status quo enriches the Washington community. If you want to understand why people do the things they do here in Washington, I can't speak for the Europeans, but I can speak for the Americans. Follow the money. Where the money leads tells you what they're going to do. And right now, they don't have any incentive to intervene and stop. You have a minority of Republicans inside the so-called Republican-dominated House that want to stop it. There are only a few senators, perhaps 11 or 12, perhaps 30 or 40 Republicans in the House. Everyone else is happy to sign on. There's another point here, and this is something that doesn't come up much. Americans, and I think probably Europeans, have lost their fear of war. I don't think they understand what real war means. Remember that all of our operations, certainly over the last, 40, 50 years, certainly the last 30, have more in common with British or French colonial expeditions into the developing world when they held empires than they do with fighting a capable nation-state opponent. We haven't taken on that sort of enemy before, and that's why with Russia, it's different. And I still think there are lots of Americans in Washington who don't understand that. They dismiss out of hand that Russia is a state that can mobilize its entire population for war. And they will do it if they see no alternative, and they will be supported by many others, not the least of which are the Chinese. And I don't think we understand what that means, because we haven't seen anything like that since 1945.
Oh, you're right. I think it's been 30 years of fighting weak adversaries. So Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen. Of course, now this great power conflict with Russia and China, obviously is something very different. But that's also why I wanted to ask you if you think, NATO seems to be prepared to cross, more and more of these red lines. And is there anyone holding this back in Washington? Because again, I see this reports now in the U.S. media that the U.S. will support long-distance weapon, and I assume the intelligence to direct these weapons to strike Crimea. At least the paper suggests Biden is warming up to attacking Crimea, through the Ukrainians, of course, and might even go deeper into Russian territory. That is, which is making the Russians set up air defense systems all the way into Moscow. And again, we seem to cross new red lines every day, and I just wonder how far Russia can be pushed, because I'm reminded of this interview by the former head of Russia analysis at the CIA, something. He gave this interview to Radio Free Europe, in which he argued, again, and this was in December of 2021, 2 months before the Russian invasion, he argued that Russia could feel pushed towards invading, and the reason was because the U.S. was creating essentially a fortress in Ukraine by supplying weapons, training, and even modernizing Ukrainian ports so they can fit the U.S. warships. His argument was that time was not on Russia's side. That was his word. So, in other words, the risk Russia faced by not invading Ukraine was being outweighed by the risk. The risk faced by invading Ukraine was being outweighed by the risk of not invading Ukraine. In other words, it couldn't afford to see this huge NATO buildup on its border. So, I was wondering if NATO now is creating a similar position for Russia, because we set up this ability now that we can strike Russia and kill Russians almost with impunity, with the assumption that they would never dare to strike back at us. But we keep crossing this new red line. So my question would be, when do we reach the level when Russia believes that the risk of striking NATO would be, or at least some training camp in Poland, would be outweighed by the risk of not striking NATO? Again, not a full-out war, but finding a way of punishing us for, stepping over this red line. So, the need effectively to deny NATO this, immunity from retaliation. Do you see this? You can only stretch this spring so far before it lashes back. I'm just wondering when are we reaching this? Because I'm already seeing a lot of different rhetoric now among the Russian leadership, especially former President Medvedev becoming much more aggressive in his language. I was just curious, when do we reach the point when Russia strikes back?
Well, there are two things that deserve to be addressed in this context. One is, as long as the European states inside NATO behave like loyal vassal states of Washington, I suppose this can continue without interruption until someone who leads a European state stands up and categorically refuses to participate, makes the points that you have, and frankly argues that there's a dramatic divergence of interest between the Europeans and Americans when it comes to Russia. That hasn't happened. If that doesn't happen, then I would say what you described is accurate and will continue. Secondly, it's funny you bring this up because a couple of historians asked to meet with me. They sent me all these emails saying it's important we talk. They described exactly what you did. How many measures can we apply before we finally cross the so-called Rubicon into real war? And they went back over the things that Franklin Roosevelt did in his administration during the 1930s and the run-up to the war with Japan, because there was no appetite in the United States to go to war with Germany. In fact, most people in the United States in the 30s were convinced that our war with Germany had been a serious mistake in 1917 and 1918. So there was enormous opposition to it. And there was certainly no interest. There wasn't even that much awareness of the Japanese, to be frank. And he talked about the various measures that were adopted up to and including the oil embargo. But he mentioned something called the McCollum Memorandum, these two historians. And that was a secret memorandum that was issued to the Department of the Navy. I don't know if Marshall saw it. I'm sure he probably did. But it essentially listed provocative things, provocative measures that should be embraced, with the clear and unambiguous goal of goading the Japanese into attacking us. And one of those was to send the United States Navy into Japanese waters in small numbers, in groups. And Roosevelt was actually told by the CNO, the chief of naval operations at the time, Mr. President, this could be construed as an act of war. We could lose ships. And FDR's comment was, well, we could afford to lose 2 or 3 small vessels, destroyers, small cruisers. In other words, he was deliberately provoking the Japanese. And each time that we illegally violated their home waters with our naval forces, each time that we were flying huge quantities of bombers to the Philippines and from the Philippines to China via India in order to beef up an air force there that was effectively a Wagnerian group type air force. We call them the Flying Tigers, the most effective air force in the history of the United States that was not part of the United States Air Force. And we were going to send dozens and dozens, ultimately hundreds of bombers that would then masquerade as Chinese Air Force assets, then firebomb Japan. This was in 1939, 40, and 41. All of this is out there. So there was no question, but this was Roosevelt's back door into the war in Europe. And when it comes to Lend-Lease, we know that he approved Lend-Lease in July to the Soviets. That was illegal. We had no relationship with the Soviet Union. We were not at war with Germany. But, his administration was overrun with NKVD agents and Soviet sympathizers. And so Lend-Lease to the Russians, or the Soviets at that time, began in July of 1941. And, I could go on and on. So they were trying to tell me, we're looking at what the Biden administration is doing, and we think we're on the road to war with Russia. Now, is that the case? Is that the deliberate plan, policy, campaign plan? I can't say that. I don't know. Just as people at the time could not say with absolute certainty, those of us watching from the outside in the 30s, what Roosevelt was doing, although people in the military knew. I don't know. I just know that the things that you've described, the things that we are doing and plan to do in the future are dangerous. And we should not assume that the Russians will simply sit there and take it. And I'm not talking about a nuclear exchange, because quite clearly the Russians have said over and over and over again they will not use a nuclear weapon unless one is used against them. The only caveat that was offered by Putin was that they too have space-based surveillance. They too watch our nuclear strike forces. And if they think we are readying a strike against them, and they're convinced of that, they could then potentially use a nuclear weapon against us. But barring that, in other words, if we make it clear we're not going to do that, we do not alert nuclear forces, we do not try to ready them, especially with our fleet overseas in the Adriatic and the Mediterranean, then there will be no danger of a nuclear exchange. But that doesn't exclude the high-end conventional fight that you talked about. And the cruise missiles that the Russians have, the Caliber cruise missiles, with conventional warheads, about 1,000-pound high-explosive warhead, can hit every airfield and every port in Europe except for the very south of Portugal.
So you don't believe that there's a possibility or likelihood of this escalating into a nuclear war, though? Or if it goes into a conventional war, it couldn't be a nuclear war by accident?
Well, I don't believe in nuclear wars by accident. I think the greater danger is that the Ukrainian armed forces over the next couple of months, under the weight of these Russian offensives, simply collapse. And you have another mass migration of whatever is left in Western Ukraine that heads west. And the Russians, who have no alternative, as you described earlier, but to move further west, do so. That's what I see happening. Then there is a danger of two things. One is that the buildup of our conventional forces, along with the Poles and selected other small European powers in Poland and to a lesser extent Romania, could try to intervene in Western Ukraine on the grounds that they are protecting refugees or protecting what remains of the Ukrainian state. I don't know. There's thinking like that in Washington. By the way, the Department of Defense opposes that. Everyone in the Department of Defense says that's an absolute dead end and will lead to an inevitable confrontation with the Russians, which everybody in the Department of Defense opposes. No one thinks that's a good idea, but they're not in charge. Just as the Department of Defense, in those days, it was called the Department of War. They were not in charge in 1939, 40, or 41. Franklin Roosevelt was. So, I think that's one possibility. But again, on the nuclear side, it would take a clear, unambiguous strike by the United States with a nuclear weapon against the Russians. And again, I still don't see any evidence that we've reached that level of insanity inside the Beltway here.
But is it possible? Because I'm thinking when the panic sets in, people make rash decisions, and I noticed that the Western media has changed its tune now. We're no longer talking about this unavoidable Ukrainian victory. Instead, I hear, we need to find a new game changer, which is why we're escalating. We need to turn the tide of the war. Obviously, not trying to turn the tide if you're winning. So I'm thinking, if, as you say, the Ukrainian army begins to collapse, and NATO already said we can't lose this war, we have to win, we have to defeat the Russians, whatever that would entail. Would there be, rash decisions being made, or would we just stand by and see our proxy fall apart? And
well, look, you're asking what
sorry,
if.
a lot of hypotheticals.
and I can't answer that with any certainty, but clearly Washington, D.C., and what I would call the New York-London axis, which controls the media and the intelligence, they're not going to change their approach at this stage. They're going to continue to drag this out as long as possible. They see no political benefit to themselves from announcing an end to it, because that would be an admission of what you just said. We're not winning, and it's not likely that we will win. And remember, Secretary Lloyd Austin in Ramstein, Germany, at the airbase, told the 50 donors, which included virtually all of the allies, donors to the Ukrainian military equipment and supplies and munitions and so forth, we don't have much time. This is a very short window of opportunity. Now, why would he say that? I think he's saying it because he knows that within the next couple of months, everything may move beyond the point where anything can be rescued in Ukraine. And I think that's probably true. So I think that's real. It's the first thing. Second thing is that it's difficult to address, once again, what the Europeans will do. Everyone, to be blunt with you, behind the scenes has a very low opinion of European leaders. When I was on active duty and I was involved in the Balkans, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then later on in Kosovo, the attitudes of the Americans at the highest levels of the Clinton administration towards the Europeans was reprehensible. Who cares what they think? The hell with them. They're a pain. They're trouble. We can get this done. We know what needs to be done. I've seen that before, and I'm hearing similar critical remarks made about the Europeans now. There is no sense that, well, if you live in Berlin, if you live in Riga, if you live in Copenhagen, if you live in Stockholm, Helsinki, if you live in proximity to the war, it matters. You know, your security is at risk. And I think large numbers of people are finding that out, which is why when you go to the consolidated public opinion polls, you know, there are all sorts of different kinds of questions you can ask, but the key answer is always the same. We favor a negotiated settlement, number one. And then you dig deeper and we don't want a war with Russia. I think that's quite clear. And I think that George Soros was right 10, 15 years ago when he wrote that paper and essentially said that. So the only way you're going to get it is with the help of Eastern Europe. Well, you've got it with Warsaw. Though I think it's unfair to say that the Polish people as a whole are ready to strap on their guns and helmets and march east. This is not 1920, and they are not up against an existential threat in Moscow that wants to consume and destroy them, the Bolsheviks. This is different, and I think a lot of Poles know that. So I'm not sure that we have a true picture yet. We'll see how this government does in the next round of elections that are coming up. So again, it goes back to Europe. The ball is in the European court. Europeans can stop this, but don't expect London or Washington to come to your aid. Remember, Charles de Gaulle said, the problem with Great Britain is it's an island. And the problem with the United States is Americans don't live in Europe. Charles de Gaulle was right.